All right, welcome everybody. This is the introductory lecture for the New Testament book study in the book of Hebrews. This is Craig Hill, and I just wanted to start with a couple of words of introduction. The book of Hebrews, you guys have chosen. I don't know if you had a choice in this matter, but it's a wonderful book, a book that for me has been a puzzle of sorts. And I've spent a lot of my professional career trying to figure out this puzzle. But remember the first time reading through the book of Hebrews, in the words of one of my teachers, it was like wading through the mud. You start out with angels, and then you move to Melchizedek, and then you're talking about high priests and sacrifices. It really is like being transported into another world when we talk about the book of Hebrews. Um, Add to that there are so many great, rich passages about assurance in this book. Um, Passages, you think about the faith of chapter 11 and chapter 12, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. But there's also such stern, strong warnings in Hebrews, like in 6:6 about the danger of falling away, that it's impossible to renew to repentance, or in 10:26 that those who sin willfully, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. And so you have this juxtaposition of great assurance on one hand, but also these stern warnings with finality to them. And it becomes this very interesting, otherworldly puzzle that we're going to be engaging in. And so, thought with a little bit of introductory material, we'd take a look at some of the issues surrounding Hebrews as a book before we get into the actual text of Hebrews. So, in terms of, for me, I did my dissertation on Hebrews. It was called Inheritance and Disinheritance in Hebrews. But the only thing that people really want to know from me when I talk to them and tell them that I did my dissertation in Hebrews is who wrote it. And most people that's kind of a funny thing. But the book of Hebrews itself is anonymous. Does not have a name attached to it within the text. And I would add to that it's also unknown historically who wrote it. And one thing we'll note is that it is the only book in the New Testament without historical traditional agreement about who wrote it. But in terms of the candidates for this, Paul is probably is if there is a traditional view on authorship, it is the Apostle Paul. There are many similarities between the book of Hebrews and other Pauline literature, like a personal greeting and warnings at the end in chapter 13. By the way, if you don't already have the PDF handout with this lecture, it would be good to go on Moodle and pull that off to be able to look at some of the comments here. Other similarities with Paul, there are a number of concepts found in Hebrews and Paul, such as the phrase like God of peace, or the life as a spiritual contest. The idea that all things have been created through Christ is a concept found in Pauline literature as well as Hebrews. The exaltation to God's right hand after suffering and death is something in Paul and Hebrews as well. New covenant, a connection with Timothy, and others, and some second century writers affirm at least an indirect Pauline authorship. So, like Tertullian in the 200s of the Common Era says that it's apostolic in its teaching, or even Pauline in its teaching, but the style is not Pauline. Some manuscripts include it among the Pauline writings, like in the earliest manuscript we have, the P46, Papyrus 46. It includes Hebrews among the Pauline corpus after Romans, probably based on length. But other manuscripts that we have include it at the end of the Pauline corpus after Philemon. And so there's a little bit of that. Arguments against a Pauline authorship. Paul's name never appears in Hebrews, which is unlike any Pauline letters. The style of Hebrews. Once you read some Greek, you'll see that Hebrews and Pauline material look very different. It's hard to explain in English, but this is one of the reasons why Clement in the first century accounted for these differences by saying that Paul wrote the letter in Hebrew, and that Luke then translated it into Greek. So there are obvious stylistic differences that were noted at its outset. The idea of Jesus as a high priest is not in Pauline writings, and that most commentaries you read today are going to not affirm Pauline authorship. So it's a majority position today among scholars that Paul did not write it. So if Paul did not write it, who else could have? Um, Luke has been mentioned as a possibility. We talked about Luke as a translator. Um, Barnabas is also put forth as a possible author of Hebrews. He's a companion of Paul, but he's an independent thinker. He's also a Levite, which, with the priestly themes in Hebrews, might make for an interesting parallel. Apollos is also offered as an author by some. He's a co-worker of Paul. He's a Jewish Christian from Alexandria, Egypt, which might have some of the philosophical leanings in Hebrews. And he is very skilled in Old Testament scriptures. Um, One name that's not on the PowerPoint, but Silas is also a name that is looked at as a possible author. He's connected with Paul and Timothy, and there are affinities with First Peter in Hebrews, and Silas is a possible author or amanuensis of First Peter. Among the most interesting names that are associated with candidacy for authorship is Priscilla of Aquila and Priscilla. If Priscilla did write it, it would be the only book in the New Testament that is authored by a woman. Um, and so there are a number of things that are possible with this. And all this to say, as I said at the outset, this is the only New Testament book without unanimous historical agreement about authorship. So most books in the New Testament have a traditional author that is associated with it, and Hebrews happens to be in the canon, not based on authorship, but based on the material within it. So a couple things, if we back up a little bit, a couple things just about authorship. Maybe in the second century, Origen had the comment, whoever wrote this letter, only God knows. So there is no unanimous agreement about this. And as this says, the canonicity is based on the contents of the book rather than the authorship. So what today tends to be the case among commentators is they will profile the author. In other words, he's an author who's very educated. He has maybe the best Greek of the New Testament. He's theologically creative. He or she is pastoral. This is maybe a sermon, very steeped in the Old Testament, but perhaps maybe someone who is lost to us in history, which is a fascinating idea, that whoever wrote this, we have no idea that whoever wrote this book, and the community that received it has been entirely lost to us by means of persecution. And that's a fascinating concept to get your head around, that something so significant historically and theologically, we have no idea of its provenance. So, fascinating idea. All right, let's talk about the audience of Hebrews. It is titled To the Hebrews, in Greek, pros Hebron, to the Hebrews. One thing about the title, the superscript, is that that's probably not original to the text. It's added at a later date. And so even the title is not helpful in determining who this was written to. And the way the conversation is typically gone is Hebrews written to a Jewish Christian audience, maybe dispersed Hebrews of the Mediterranean region, or maybe people in Jerusalem or something like that. But at the same time, and certainly the concepts within Hebrews are very Jewish in that they draw on the Old Testament and they talk about sacrificial systems and old and previous covenant practices. But at the same time, the Greek in Hebrews is so it's so highfalutin, if you will. It's very educated. It's close to classical Greek in its structure and syntax. And so you wonder, just can we make these? Can we talk categorically about Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, or is there quite a bit of overlap within this? And which has led many, and I think this is probably the best way to think about this, is that we don't know. It's really the ethnic background of these folks is going to be a complex mixture of Jewishness and Gentileness. as we even see in the early Jesus movement. Um, and also to add that, so let's say we do say these are Jewish Christians, or we say these are Gentile Christians. Does that help us in any way in interpreting the text? It's probably best to just let the text sit on its own and imagine that these are Christians of the first century that that are part of a dominant Greco-Roman culture with evidence of a prominent Jewish subculture within that, but a community that is really born out of this early followers of Jesus community. And so we have a very complex community here that we're dealing with in Hebrews. And it can't really be just simplified into Jewish or Gentile. That's a very complex statement. In terms of where this audience is at, I think we can probably say that this is a city. In other words, this book is not like the book of James or First Peter or Galatians that are encyclicals that are meant to be that are sent to us to a region. But probably this is a book that's written to a specific community in a specific locale, a specific city. Now, if that's the case, it doesn't say where in the book, but many people will argue that Rome is a destination. In 1324, the author says, "Those from Italy send you greetings." Maybe that means that there are some Italians within the author's traveling party, and they're greeting their compatriots back in Rome. Add to that the book of First Clement, which is a second century writing, was written in Rome, and it is the first extra canonical book to include material from Hebrews. So maybe that gives a nod to a Roman destination. If there is a majority position in the history of the church, it is the idea that the book is written to Jerusalem, to Christians in Jerusalem. All the centrality of tabernacle or priesthood and sacrifices make for a very tempting idea that this is written somewhere back to the saints in Jerusalem. Other options have been if Apollos has written it, perhaps Corinth is the city. And then some people have argued that this is written into Egypt, North Africa, Alexandria. There is some evidence of Jewish temple cultus in Egypt, as well as Neoplatonic thought in Philo and etc. But anyway, those are the options. You can read in the commentaries some of the introductory material about these possible ideas. In terms of if we've gone to profiling the author, let's profile the audience. What does this audience look like? Like I said, a specific church in a geographical location. This is not an encyclical. It's not a pass around. This is to a body. It's also to a group that has endured some degree of persecution. You look in 1032, and the author says in 1032 talks about we recall the former days when after you were enlightened you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those who were so treated. But you had compassion on those who were in prison, and you joyfully accepted the seizure of your own property, since you yourselves knew you have a better possession, an abiding one. So you have this issue of persecution. We also read in chapter 12 that you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. So what the nature of this persecution is like, maybe not bloodshed, but you have social ostracism, maybe even the seizure of property. And so that's a little bit of what we're looking at with persecution. We also know that this audience knew Timothy. The author says, when Timothy is released to you, that's when I'll come to you as well. So, which is probably one of the reasons why Timothy is not an option for authorship, because he's mentioned in the book itself as a third party. And then the audience is also knowledgeable in the Old Testament, enough to be swayed by an argument from the Old Testament. So whether that is Jewish or, look, if the Gentiles come to faith in Jesus, if any Gentile comes to faith in Jesus, their Bible, their scriptures are what we would call the Old Testament. So that's not a slam dunk that this is a Jewish audience necessarily in that sense. One question is, this idea of whether they're Hebrew or Hellenistic. It's hard to say and we've talked a little bit about that, but could these people have had some kind of access to Hebrew temple cultus and sacrifice because of the argument within it? That's a possibility, but we have to kind of put that out tentatively. And as you are doing your reading, I would encourage you to kind of imagine where this group could be, as much as you know about the Greco-Roman world of the first century. As we kind of conclude um, uh, this idea, let's talk about the date of Hebrews, this introductory material. Usually, where this falls is either the book of Hebrews is written before 70 CE or post 70 CE. And the reason for that is the city of Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. And there's no mention of that in the book. And you would imagine that if the author is saying Jesus has put an end to sacrifice, that the destruction of the temple might have been a fairly meaningful argument to include, but he does not include that. He or she does not include that in the argument. So it depends. Although the author of Hebrews only talks about tabernacle, not temple. So anyway, 70 CE is usually, you either fall on the pre side or the post side of that, depending on what commentary you're reading. We read in 1323 that Timothy is alive. So is that post 70 or pre? We also know that it is cited by Clement of Rome, which we discussed earlier in AD 95. And we also have some sense in chapter 2, verse 3, it talks about when we first heard. It says, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard. So the audience heard the gospel from eyewitnesses, or the author heard the gospel from eyewitnesses, however that works. And so the question is, where does this fall in terms of dating? And we mentioned that there's no shedding of blood, and perhaps as we think about what that might have looked like in when we think about what that might have looked like in the Greco-Roman world of the first century, Claudius, we find, does do some expulsion of Jews from Rome in Acts 18, and that's fairly early. Whereas Nero in the 60s does shed blood of Christians. And so it's hard to tell one way or another, but maybe if we think about that a tentative, at least from my perspective, I tend to look at Hebrews from a pre-70 CE starting point. But again, I'm holding that with fairly open hands. It is a tentative starting point, but I'm not even sure if it really helps in the interpretation of the book. But if I was pushed into a corner, that's probably where I would go. So I hope this information has been helpful to you as we think about the book of Hebrews and this introductory material. You can look at the PDF to talk about the occasion of the book. I kind of posit this idea. I drew on the PDF, I drew from Craig Kester's commentary about the situation, the first phase of proclamation and conversion, which is where people are convinced of the Jesus is superior. Jews are convinced of that. Gentiles then come in. If we look at a Pauline model of what this might have looked like, that Paul goes into a town, and again, Paul is probably not the author, but as we think about first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, perhaps we take that, but we think that eventually we have this new covenant community as having both Jews and Gentiles in it. But there's a phase then that happens in which persecution takes place. That there's physical abuse, maybe loss of property, pressure is exerted perhaps on those that have come out of this previous covenant synagogue into a new assembly, and that as this is done, this pressure is exerted, that there is a danger, or that there is a tendency then to want to shrink back or neglect this new faith, or whatever it is. There's pressure and there's sliding morale and friction, and a lot of this is this idea of falling away or neglecting salvation. Could this be a return to the synagogue? this is a possibility, but it is only a hypothesis. And this is something that as we read in our commentaries and as we move forward in our study, that we want to start to imagine what was it that these people were facing? What is the issue? What is the problem that our author sees as the occasion for which to preach a sermon like this, to write a letter like this, to try to persuade his audience to do what? And as we think about this, that's our introductory material in Hebrews. And hope you have a great time doing work in your commentary reading this week and as you look at Hebrews.